Today I'm answering your questions on records, bands, and more. First question comes from Matt Lane, and Matt writes, what is one band or artist that everyone seems to like that you just can't get behind? These questions are tough to answer because it all comes down to personal taste, right? You may have a band that you love, which I just don't care for, and vice versa. And to me, that is not a problem, right? Like, our differences make us more interesting. If everyone loved the same music, I think life would be pretty boring. That said, Matt did ask the question, so I'm going to throw it out there as being U2. U2 is a band I just don't care for. I don't like Bono. I don't really dig the music. That band has never really resonated with me. There's some stuff I like. I dig the Rattle and Hum album. I own that one. That one's pretty good. But for the most part, their catalog doesn't speak to me at all. Again, nothing wrong with that. If you like U2, that's awesome. I'm a fan of Black Sabbath. There's a lot of people who don't like Sabbath. Again, it's our differences that make us interesting. Robert Aiken writes, two-part question, if I may, Frank. Yes, Robert, of course. Okay, the first one is, what albums have you bought and refused to play more than once due to not liking? First one that comes to mind, Iron Maiden, Book of Souls. I probably listened to this. He asked an album I listened to once. I probably listened to this 2 or 3 times, but it just didn't work for me. And I'm a Maiden fan, at least of their 1980s output. And then after that, I kind of lost interest in the Blaze Bayley era. Nowadays, they seem to be kind of this hard rock, heavy metal, prog band. And that, again, it's just not for me. These 12-minute songs. You know, they did Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner back in the day. It was 8 minutes or whatever. I was fine with that. But now every single song seems to be like this epic thing. I just wish they would have a producer that would sit them down and say, guys, cut it with these long songs. Let's trim this down. Cut the fat off. But that's not happening. So this is the album I got, thinking I'm going to try Maiden again. And again, it didn't work for me. And again, nothing wrong with that. A ton of you like this album. It wasn't for me, but this is an album I'll probably never listen to again. Book of Souls, Iron Maiden. The second part of Robert's question is, what are albums that you loved but will not be played again due to overexposure? That is the worst thing when you love an album and it just, after a while, you're like, man, I've heard that too many times. Here are a couple of quick examples. AC/DC's Back in Black. I think classic rock radio growing up ruined this for me because they played the hell out of You Shook Me All Night Long, Hell's Bells, Back in Black. So that's one example. Another example is Led Zeppelin 2 for the same reason. I love this album. I know it inside out, but again, they played the key tracks on here so many times on classic rock radio growing up. I grew really tired of this album. Doesn't mean I'll never listen to Back in Black or Led Zeppelin 2 again. You know, there's always that time when you're just sitting there and you just think of an album you want to listen to it. So I'll probably pull these out again at some point. But man, these are 2 records, great records that I'm really tired of. This next question. Hi Frank, what's your favorite soundtrack on vinyl you own? And what's your favorite horror movie soundtrack? I'm a big fan of movies. I'm also a big fan of music. And I love when those 2 things can be paired perfectly because a good soundtrack can really take a movie over the top. This is probably my favorite soundtrack of all time. This is the Judgment Night soundtrack. And on this record, the producers paired hard rock, heavy metal bands with hip hop artists. And they produced some really cool stuff, like some of the combinations on here, like House of Pain and Helmet, Cypress Hill and Sonic Youth, Onyx and Biohazard, Ice-T and Slayer. Great tracks. I recently got the movie on Blu-ray. It took me forever to find it. And the movie doesn't necessarily stand the test of time. It's still a fun watch, but the soundtrack definitely does stand the test of time. This is probably one of my favorite movies of all time, Pulp Fiction. And the soundtrack on here, Quentin Tarantino did such a great job pairing the music with the movies, man. It's just, you can't picture the movie Pulp Fiction without those songs going through your head. So it's another great soundtrack. The second part of the question pertained to horror movie soundtracks. My favorite horror movie soundtrack is actually the score to John Carpenter's 1978 movie Halloween. Carpenter nailed it with that one. I just recently, this past Halloween, had some friends over and we were watching that movie again, as I tend to do every year, and we were commenting on how that movie would not be nearly half as creepy or half as scary without John Carpenter's scores. That is definitely my favorite, and that is one I don't actually own on vinyl. I do have Halloween 2. This is a French import. Not quite as good, but pretty darn good. I also have the Halloween 2 reissue on Death Waltz. And I have a couple of the more recent ones that Carpenter did, including Halloween 2018 and Halloween Kills. One of these days, I'm going to track down Halloween 1978 on vinyl, even if it is a reissue, because that is such a good score. This next question comes from Dave. Dave says, do you have a favorite under-the-radar band or artist that you wish more people would discover, but secretly hope they will not become too popular, too mainstream / commercial and or overplayed? This is an interesting question. It brings me right back to my high school days. I'm not sure if you were like this back in the day, but man, I wanted my favorite bands to be my bands. I never wanted them to hit the mainstream. I didn't want everyone to know about my favorite bands because it was kind of my thing or our thing with my friends. My thinking has evolved over the years, whereas now I'm at the point where there's a bunch of bands I love that no one really knows about, and I wish they could get bigger. I wish more people could find out about them. Here are a couple examples. This first one is this band out of Toronto, Canada called Blood Ceremony. This is my favorite album by them called Lord of Misrule. And I heard about these guys because I was reading a review, and the reviewer referred to them as flute-tinged witch rock. I was like, man, that has to be cool. Blood Ceremony are female fronted, kind of a throwback sound to the early 70s. Think kind of like Jethro Tull meets early Black Sabbath, a really good band. Here's another one. I don't talk about country music too often. I'm not a huge country music fan, except for certain stuff, right? Like the modern bro country, forget about it. I don't want nothing to do with that, but Johnny Cash, of course, the old school guys, and Corb Lund. He's an active artist nowadays, and it's kind of like, how would you describe him? It's like alt country, outlaw country, that kind of stuff. He's from Alberta here in Canada. I have all his records. He's still touring. He tours all the time. He's around my age. Well worth checking out, even if you're not really into country. This is old school stuff, really good. And which album would I recommend? I got a ton of them. I don't know. This is probably one of his more commercial ones, Things That Can't Be Undone. It's really good. Agricultural Tragic, that's one of his newer ones, also really killer. And Cabin Fever, another really good album from Corb Lund. I got one more. I'm not sure if you call him under the radar anymore. This is Gary Clark Jr. I believe he's from Texas. He's a blues guy, but modern blues. Blues is interesting because it's such a traditional genre, and so few players in the blues want to kind of color outside of the lines, if that makes any sense. So few players in the blues genre like to or want to or are able to experiment. Gary Clark Jr. is an exception. He is a blues man, but he mixes even elements of like hip hop and modern rock and modern production on his stuff. He also does a wicked version of the Beatles' Come Together, probably the best cover I've ever heard of Come Together. But yeah, he's an artist well worth checking out if you're not familiar with him. Michael writes, is there a band that you liked when you were younger but no longer care for? Actually, Michael has two questions, but I'll come to the second one in a moment. In terms of this question, usually for me, if I like a band as a kid or if I like a band anytime, I kind of like them for life. That's just me. That's the way I roll. But lately, I've been getting tired of Motley Crue. And let me explain why. I kind of got a bad taste over that whole retirement thing a few years ago where they held a news conference. They signed that contract saying that after this is over, they'll never tour again. And then guess what? A few years later, Motley Crue's back. And I believe they never actually intended to retire. I think the plan all along was to come back. And I don't know, man. Just not cool. And then lately, Nikki's been bad-mouthing Mick Mars. And again, just left a bad taste in my mouth. So I still love Motley Crue, especially those first two records. But they're a band I haven't been listening to a lot lately just because I got kind of tired of all the shenanigans, right? Don't treat your fans like that. If you're going to retire and you make a big deal out of it, saying everyone else says they're retiring and they come back, but we are different. If you're going to do that, at least be true to your word, right? Be true to your word. That's all I ask for. Second part of Michael's question, is there an album that flew under your radar years ago and have recently discovered? Oh man, so many. That is the best part about being a record collector and speaking to other record collectors is discovering new music, because there's decades of fantastic music. But here's just one little example. This is a band called Lucifer's Friend. This is their self-titled debut album from 1970. A friend of mine, when we lived in Edmonton, introduced me to this band. Really, they only have one excellent album. That was this, the debut. After that, the band changed styles and kind of went downhill. So I'm sure people dig them, but for me, I love this record. They never got this good again. The sound is like Deep Purple meets Led Zeppelin meets Black Sabbath, that kind of thing. And this album cover, this is one of my favorite album covers of all time too, just awesome. So this is a band that flew under my radar and I'm happy to have finally discovered and gotten into. These next two questions are pretty similar. John writes, how heavy does your music taste go? Slayer, Napalm Death, etc. And Metal Mickey writes, what's the heaviest, most extreme metal album in your collection? My taste honestly does not run very heavy. There's no death metal on my shelves. There's no black metal. The heaviest thing is probably Slayer. I got a handful of Slayer records. I got all those early ones, which I really dig, but that's about as heavy as it gets. This comes from Vince. He writes, people always give us a desert island list. My question is, what albums from bands you love would not travel to desert island with you? I enjoy Kiss, he says, but sadly enough, Alive would stay home. Revenge would come with me. This is interesting. I love Kiss. I love Revenge, but I would take Alive over Revenge because there's more stuff on there. And to me, those songs are a little more timeless. But again, this speaks to our differences in musical taste, which is not a bad thing. It's a welcome thing because it makes life more interesting, I think. But okay, how do I answer this question? Let me pick a band. Let's say Judas Priest. So a lot of people, if they're stuck on a desert island, if they had to bring a Judas Priest record, they would probably pick Painkiller, but that would not be my pick. I remember getting Painkiller as a new release. And of course, the intro with the drums, it was just a rejuvenated Judas Priest. And I dug that track. I like a few songs on there, but for me, the lyrics are just really silly. And there's some throwaway tracks on there. So if I had to bring a Judas Priest record, I would bring either Screaming for Vengeance or Defenders of the Faith. Andrew writes, do you have any favorite live albums? My personal favorites are Rory Gallagher's Stage Struck, UFO, Strangers in the Night, Triumph Stages, and Lizzie Live and Dangerous. Man, so many great live albums. I think Live After Death from Iron Maiden, 1985, is probably one of my favorites. That was the band, at least in my opinion, just firing on all cylinders. I also really love, I didn't pull out a copy, it's on my shelf, but Ozzy Osbourne's 1982 live album, Speak of the Devil, which is all Black Sabbath songs. That album was my introduction to many of those songs. I love how raw that record is. I love the fact that Ozzy just sounds smashed out of a skull. I think the vocals were re-recorded after the fact, like they are with many live albums, but I still love that record, man. Speak of the Devil is one of my favorites. RL writes, as you and the rest of us age, have your musical tastes changed? Yeah, in a sense they have. I mean, the bands I liked when I was a teenager, I still like, but I think my musical tastes have expanded and I'm open to more styles of music nowadays, right? Like back in the 80s when you were a kid, it's like that one genre and you stick to it and you're kind of ridiculed by your friends and if you venture too far outside of it. But even now, looking back, there's all sorts of great 80s pop music, which at the time I didn't admit that I liked, but as I said, some classics back then. I can think of a couple examples like George Michael's Careless Whisper, one of the best pop songs ever written. Same with Cyndi Lauper's Time After Time. Huey Lewis, his whole catalog. There's so many great artists and songs from across all decades that I'm much more open to listening to now. And, you know, even today, just different genres like jazz. I'm far from an expert, but I do listen to some jazz and all sorts of cool stuff, man. Just if my advice for any young record collector is don't limit your musical taste to one genre. Just discover whatever is out there that you like, because there's just so much great music. All right, 33ers, how would you have answered the questions in today's video? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching to the end of this episode. As always, I appreciate your time. I'll be back again real soon. Until then, keep on spinning.